The check still exists. It sits behind glass in a frame inside a museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania. It's a bank document dated December 18, 1911, signed by Milton Snavely Hershey, the man who had built a chocolate company from nothing and turned a Pennsylvania cornfield into an entire city. The amount is $300 American. The recipient is the White Star Line. The memo line, written in ink at the bottom: Cabin deposit, RMS Titanic, maiden voyage. The check cleared. The reservation was made. And then, a few weeks later, something happened. The company records don't say exactly what. And Milton Hershey was nowhere near a dock on April 10, 1912. He was already home. This is the story of 6 people who should have been aboard the Titanic. Some changed their plans for trivial reasons. Others were saved by coincidences that resist any rational explanation. At least one of them escaped the Titanic only to die on another ship 3 years later. And one of them, without knowing it, helped save more than 700 people that the Titanic could not kill. Milton Hershey. Milton Hershey was 52 years old in April 1912. He had built his chocolate company in the decade prior, turning a Swiss milk recipe into a product any American could buy for a penny. The city he had founded in Pennsylvania, with streets named Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue, with a power plant, a streetcar system, an amusement park, and a school for orphaned children, was less than 10 years old and already one of the most extraordinary stories in American capitalism. Hershey and his wife Catherine, whom everyone called Kitty, had spent the winter of 1911 to 1912 on the French Riviera. Kitty suffered from a chronic illness that doctors of the time couldn't name precisely, and whose symptoms seemed to ease in the warm southern French climate. The Hersheys spent much of each year in Europe because of it. For the return trip in April 1912, Milton had reserved a first-class suite on the most famous ship in the world. The company archives confirm the $300 deposit made in December, 10% of the total cost of a first-class suite, which ranged between $3,000 and $4,000. The suite included a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, dressing rooms, a private bathroom, and a private deck overlooking the sea. What happened next is the kind of thing historians describe as not entirely documented. The Hershey Company records say only that Milton found it necessary to return earlier than planned. Some newspaper accounts from the time suggest a business matter called him back home. Others say Kitty fell ill before the scheduled departure. The company never confirmed which version is accurate. What is documented is that Milton Hershey did not wait for the Titanic. He canceled the reservation. The $300 check was returned, stamped "canceled," and it is that document now framed inside the museum and booked passage on the German liner America, departing France on April 6, 1912, arriving in New York on April 7th. Kitty stayed in Europe with traveling companions and returned later. Milton Hershey had been home in Pennsylvania for 8 days when the Titanic sank. What he didn't know, and would only discover afterward, is that the America had a curious role in that story. On April 14th, sailing through the North Atlantic, the America's captain spotted 2 large icebergs sitting directly in the Titanic's path and sent a warning telegram. Captain Smith of the Titanic replied with his thanks. The ship held its course. Milton Hershey survived to build the Hotel Hershey, the City Theater, the Botanical Garden, the sports arena, and dozens of other landmarks that make up Hershey, Pennsylvania today. Kitty died in 1915, 3 years after the sinking, from the same illness that had brought them to the French Riviera in the first place. Milton Hershey never remarried. He lived until 1945, dying at 88. Before he died, he donated the majority of his fortune, estimated at $100 million, to the orphan school he had founded decades earlier. the $300 check remains. It is the only physical document proving that one of the richest men in America was days away from boarding the most famous ship in the world. It sits framed beside a note explaining what he missed and what the world almost lost along with him. Guglielmo Marconi. In March 1912, the White Star Line made Guglielmo Marconi an offer that would have been difficult for any ordinary person to refuse. Free passage on the most luxurious ship ever built, on the most anticipated inaugural voyage in maritime history, for the inventor whose radio equipment was installed on nearly every major ocean liner in the world, including the Titanic itself. It was, in essence, a public demonstration that the man and the technology were inseparable. Marconi was 37 years old. He had been born in Bologna, the son of a wealthy Italian and an Irish woman from the Jameson family, the same family behind the whiskey. He had dropped out of university as a young man, convinced that the theory he was developing in the makeshift laboratories on his family's estate mattered more than any degree. In 1909, he had received the Nobel Prize in Physics for the development of the wireless telegraph. His Marconigrams, as wireless telegrams were popularly called, were the most modern technology available in maritime transport, and the two radio operators aboard the Titanic were direct employees of his company. Marconi turned down the White Star Line's offer. The reason, recorded by his daughter Degna in memoirs published years later, is precise in its banality. He had work to do and preferred the public stenographer traveling aboard the Lusitania, which would depart from Liverpool 3 days before the Titanic. It was a matter of efficiency. A stenographer he was more familiar with, on a ship leaving earlier, on a schedule that fit his plans better. Marconi boarded the Lusitania on April 9, 1912. The Titanic sailed from Southampton on April 10th. In the early hours of April 15th, the Titanic's two radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, both Marconi Company employees, sent the first distress signals in maritime history using the equipment Marconi had invented. The Carpathia, 93 kilometers away, received the signal and steamed at full speed toward the wreck site. More than 700 people were rescued. When the Carpathia docked in New York with the survivors, Marconi was waiting on the pier. He boarded with a reporter from the New York Times and interviewed Harold Bride, the only one of the two operators to have survived. The other, Jack Phillips, had died in the water. The British Postmaster General later told Parliament that those who were saved through one man, Mr. Marconi, and his marvelous invention. It was difficult to imagine a more complete irony. The man who had refused to travel on the ship had become the hero of the sinking. But Marconi's story with ocean liners didn't end there. 3 years later, in April 1915, Marconi boarded the Lusitania again, the same ship he had taken instead of the Titanic, to testify in a legal proceeding in New York. He completed the voyage, disembarked, handled his business, and returned to Europe on a different ship. The Lusitania departed New York, heading the other direction on May 1, 1915. On May 7th, a German submarine torpedoed her off the coast of Ireland. 1,198 people died. Marconi had escaped two of the greatest maritime disasters in history by margins of days. He died in 1937, at 63, in Rome, of a heart attack. No icebergs, no torpedoes. Just a heart that stopped. Henry Clay Frick Suite, B-52, 54, and 56 was the most expensive accommodation available for reservation on the Titanic. It had a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, dressing rooms, a private bathroom, and a private deck overlooking the sea. The same private deck that J.P. Morgan had ordered installed when he imagined he would be making the voyage. It was the kind of accommodation that only exists in a world where the gap between classes is so vast that architecture makes it visible. Henry Clay Frick had reserved the suite in February 1912. He was 62 years old, chairman of the Carnegie Steel Company, and one of the most controversial figures in American capitalism. 2 decades earlier, he had ordered armed agents against striking workers at the Homestead plant, in a confrontation that left men dead on both sides and permanently marked his public reputation. He was also one of America's greatest art collectors, buying Rembrandt, Vermeer, and El Greco with the same coldness with which he had managed steel mills. Frick and his wife Adelaide were in Europe buying art and traveling when she sprained her ankle. Accounts vary on the exact location. Some say Italy, others mention Madeira during a cruise on the Adriatic. But the result was the same. Adelaide needed medical attention, couldn't board a ship for a long Atlantic crossing, and the reservation was canceled. What happened next with Suite B-52 is a story in itself. The White Star Line offered it to J.P. Morgan, the banker who controlled the company that controlled the White Star Line. Morgan accepted, then canceled, citing business interests keeping him in Europe. The suite was then reserved by Horace Harding, a New York financier. Harding and his wife canceled when they secured an earlier sailing on the Mauretania. The suite sat empty until it received its final occupant, J. Bruce Ismay, chief executive of the White Star Line, who survived the sinking by climbing into a lifeboat while there was still room, and spent the rest of his life being called a coward in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. Adelaide Frick's ankle had passed through 4 pairs of hands before reaching Ismay's. Henry Clay Frick returned to America on another ship, bought more art, and spent the following years overseeing the construction of his Manhattan mansion. He died in December 1919, at 69, of a heart attack. He left the mansion and the entire art collection to the city of New York. The Frick collection, as it is known today, receives more than 200,000 visitors a year. None of them know, walking in, that a woman's twisted ankle on a Mediterranean cruise was the reason that place exists. Alfred Vanderbilt. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt was 34 years old in April 1912. He was heir to one of the greatest American fortunes, his great-grandfather Cornelius. Vanderbilt had built an empire of railroads and shipping, and the money had grown with each passing generation until Alfred inherited a sum that newspapers of the time struggled to put into comprehensible numbers. He was, by all accounts, a pleasant man for someone so immeasurably wealthy. He liked horses, traveled through Europe, and showed none of the cruelty that had characterized earlier generations of Vanderbilts. Alfred was returning from a trip to Europe when he decided not to board the Titanic. The records don't document the exact reason. Some accounts mention a last-minute change of plans, others a preference for another ship. What is documented is that he canceled so late that some American newspapers, in the first hours after the sinking, included his name on the list of passengers presumed to be aboard. His mother, who read the news with her heart in her throat, only received a telegram confirming he was alive and on dry land hours later. Alfred probably assumed he had gotten lucky. It was the kind of story you tell at dinner. The man who almost sailed on the Titanic. He lived 3 more years. In May 1915, Alfred Vanderbilt boarded the Lusitania in New York, bound for Liverpool. He was heading to a meeting of the International Horse Breeders Association and had promised the British Red Cross a fleet of wagons for transporting war wounded. In the days before departure, Germany had published warnings in American newspapers declaring the waters around the British Isles a war zone and stating that any ship sailing under an enemy flag was subject to attack. Alfred also received an anonymous telegram. Its sender was never identified, advising him not to travel. He laughed it off as a prank. On May 7, 1915, The German submarine U-20 torpedoed the Lusitania off the coast of County Cork, Ireland. The ship sank in 18 minutes. 1,198 people died. Alfred Vanderbilt was seen by multiple witnesses distributing life jackets to passengers and helping place children into lifeboats. He wore no life jacket himself. According to several accounts, he had given his to a young mother holding an infant in her arms, tying it onto her with his own hands because she couldn't manage the knot while holding the child. Alfred Vanderbilt could not swim. His body was never found. The man who had escaped the Titanic by days died on the Lusitania 3 years later, giving his life jacket to a stranger on a ship that sank in under 20 minutes. The irony needs no comment. The memorial erected by his British friends on a road south of Dorking in England reads simply, "A gallant gentleman and a fine sportsman." The Slade brothers. Alfred Slade was 25 years old. His brother Bertram was 26. Thomas was 27. All three were stokers, the men who fed the furnaces on steamships, and all three were experienced sailors. Bertram and Thomas had been transferred from the Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, to the new vessel. Alfred had recently finished a tour on the Highland Glen. All three signed their employment contracts for the Titanic on April 6, 1912. On the morning of April 10th, the Slade brothers reported to the ship at 8 o'clock, as required. They signed in. And then, like many crew members that morning, they decided to spend the remaining hours before the noon departure having a drink in Southampton. They went to the Grapes, a pub a short walk from the docks. Around 11:15, two colleagues joined them, John Podesta and William Nutbean, who had been drinking elsewhere but decided to stop by. At 10 minutes to 12, the group left the pub. What happened in the following 10 minutes is not entirely documented. What is known is that when the Slade brothers reached the dock, the gangway had been pulled. The Titanic was departing. The British Board of Trade Records list all three as missed the ship, the official designation for crew members who failed to make departure. They were, in a sense, disembarked without ever having embarked. None of the three boarded another ship that day. None of the three died in the North Atlantic that April. The Slade brothers continued their lives as sailors. The historical record does not document what they felt when they learned that the ship they had missed by minutes was sitting at the bottom of the ocean. It was the kind of thing a man probably didn't tell many people, and perhaps told everyone. George Vanderbilt, George Washington Vanderbilt Secker, was different from the other members of his family. While the more famous Vanderbilts built fortunes in railroads and banking, George had used his inheritance to construct the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, a 250-room mansion, the largest private residence still standing in the United States, modeled after the chateau of the Loire Valley, complete with vineyards, hunting grounds, and a forest of tens of thousands of acres managed according to the principles of modern forestry. George and his wife Edith had booked passage on the Titanic. Someone in the family, the records don't say who exactly, and the stated reason is described only as objections to the risks of a maiden voyage, persuaded them to cancel. The reservation was called off on April 9th, one day before departure. George Vanderbilt's luggage did not receive the same message. For some reason of logistics, a miscommunication with staff, a notice that arrived too late, the kind of bureaucratic failure that was common at the organizational scale a voyage like this required, the couple's trunks and belongings were loaded onto the Titanic as originally planned. They were in the hold when the ship left Southampton. They were in the hold when it struck the iceberg. They were in the hold when it sank. The Vanderbilts arrived in New York on another ship. Their luggage arrived at the bottom of the North Atlantic, 3,800 meters below the surface, where it remains today. George Vanderbilt died 2 years later. in July 1914 of complications following an appendectomy. He was 46 years old. The estate passed to Edith and then to his daughter Cornelia. The contents of the trunks were never publicly listed. No one knows exactly what the ocean holds. The Just Missed It Club formed quickly after the disaster. A Michigan newspaper published a notice on April 20, 1912, 5 days after the sinking, reporting that the club had been founded with 6,904 members. In the days that followed, the number grew to more than 118,000. It was impossible. The Titanic couldn't hold more than 3,300 people, including passengers and crew. Most of the club's members were inventing their proximity to the disaster, seeking perhaps some form of belonging to the most famous tragedy in the world. But some were real. A cancelled check, a stenographer on a different ship, a sprained ankle, a pub in Southampton, an unrecorded objection from someone in the family, a trunk that traveled without its owner. The Titanic sank at 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912. 1,517 people died. The reasons why each of the people in this story was not among them are, each in their own way, absurd in their ordinariness. None of it was fate. It was a check, an ankle, a stenographer, a beer, a trunk, and an objection from someone whose name history did not preserve.